This is Autohaus Hamilton TV. I'm James, and today I'm going to be talking about lots of things. Predominantly flywheels, but also about some of the concepts that go along with and around flywheels. We'll start off with, what is a flywheel? A flywheel is a weight attached to the end of the crankshaft. What we have here is a standard 915 flywheel. Regular weight, it's not a lightened flywheel, and I'll come back to that in a second. And you'll also notice that it is one solid piece of metal. It's machined and it's carefully balanced so it doesn't introduce vibrations when the engine is doing its work. And it has three main jobs. The first job of the flywheel is to be a store of kinetic energy. It's so that when the engine is between pulses, it keeps things moving on. So it keeps things rotating. It's not as big a deal on a multi-cylinder engine as it is on a single-cylinder engine. If you consider a single-cylinder engine, you've got a much longer interval between firing pulses, and the flywheel then keeps the engine turning over. So the first thing that a flywheel does is basically smooth out the pulses of an engine's firing. The second thing that it does is that it acts as a surface for the clutch friction disc to act on. So when you're engaging and disengaging your car's clutch, the friction disc is working against the flywheel. And the third thing that a flywheel does is it helps counteract harmonics as they work their way up and down the crankshaft. I'll come back to that in a whole lot more detail later. Now, in Porsche world, up until the 964, cars had a solid flywheel, something like this, as I said before, just a single piece of machined metal. From the 964 onwards, Porsche 911s went on to a dual mass flywheel, and a dual mass flywheel looks like this. Here we have a dual mass flywheel. In this case, it's a dual mass flywheel from a 996, but the idea is the same for every car that uses a dual mass flywheel. So a dual mass flywheel, as its name implies, consists of two different mass items, and they're linked together. You can see the join of them here. They're linked together with a system of springs. So now the flywheel is split in two, and those two halves of the flywheel can rotate against each other, and those internal springs snap the two halves back together. What that does is to improve drivability in two ways, by making it easier for the clutch to take up, because you take up the clutch against the friction surface and the other surface moves against it, and then the springs pull it together. And the other way it improves smoothness is because those two halves move against each other with the pulses of the engine's firing, and that acts to give a smoother sensation, particularly when the car is idling. Cars fitted with a single mass flywheel get a two-part clutch friction disc. So what we have here is the friction disc for a 915 car. So that would be as used for 911s from 1972 up to 1986. And you can see that that friction disc is manufactured as two halves that are joined together with springs. So in the same way that the two halves of a dual mass flywheel are able to move against each other when drive is taken up with the clutch, in the case of a single mass flywheel, that particular function is taken up by the fact that you've got a two-part sprung-centered friction disc. For the 996 that we talked about, the clutch friction disc looks very different. And here's a 996 friction disc, and you can see that instead of having the springs to join two halves, in this case it's just a single item. And that's a large part of why you can't just use a single mass flywheel where a dual mass flywheel is intended to be fitted, because you need to change the friction disc so that you've got a friction disc with some give in it. Otherwise, taking up the clutch will be very unpleasant and very jerky. I mentioned earlier that the other job that the flywheel does is to counteract harmonics. Before we go into any more detail, we need to get an understanding of what I mean by harmonics, where they come from, and the damage they can cause. If you go to a music concert, you might feel your chest cavity vibrating with the bass drum, or when the bass player plays a note. So that's kind of an example of harmonics. Something vibrating somewhere else causes something else, namely you, to vibrate in sympathy with it. And something similar happens with a car's crankshaft. If you consider while the engine is running, you're getting pulses being transmitted through the connecting rods between the piston and the crankshaft, and they set up vibrations that run the length of the crankshaft. Those harmonic vibrations run up and down the length of the crankshaft until they're absorbed, and if they're not absorbed, you can get resonance happening. When resonance happens, those frequencies, if you think of them as waves running the length of the crankshaft, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, there are examples of bridges being caught in crosswinds, and the crosswinds cause harmonic frequencies to travel the length of the bridge and destroy the bridge. You may be familiar with the example of an opera singer singing a high-pitched note to cause a wine glass to vibrate in sympathy and resonate and destroy the wine glass. And I'm going to do a similar experiment today. Now, I don't have an opera singer's voice, and also I couldn't afford to risk destroying a crystal wine glass, so I'm going to try a similar experiment with something a little bit more low-key. So here goes. Let's see if this works. You should see the cup will start to vibrate in sympathy with my voice, and with a bit of luck I'll be able to destroy the cup just with the power of harmonics. And there you go. Science at work. So the importance of that is to reinforce the idea that the clutch as designed for your car, whatever your car happens to be, is such that changing it drastically, in this case looking for a single mass flywheel to replace a dual mass flywheel, may introduce severe unintended consequences, because you're opening yourself up to the possibility of harmonics destroying your crankshaft. The last thing I want to talk about is the weight, or if you want to be a science geek, the mass of the flywheel itself. As with everything in engineering, there are trade-offs and there are consequences, and there isn't necessarily a completely right solution. You will see the option of lighter flywheels for cars. Now, a lighter flywheel allows the engine to spin up a bit quicker. Early on in this video, I talked about a flywheel being a store of energy, and to act as a store of energy, it needs to have energy imparted to it. Now, the heavier a flywheel is, the more energy it takes to get it moving, and that's a negative. But there's a benefit, because a heavier flywheel stores more energy. So a car with a heavier flywheel, all other things being equal, which they usually aren't, is easier to get off the line, because when you're engaging the clutch, that energy that's stored in the flywheel finds its way into the drive, and you pull off easier and smoother. A car with a lighter flywheel is a little bit harder to get off the line, because you've got less of that stored kinetic energy to impart into the drive mechanism and on its way to the rear wheels to get you moving. But there's always pros and cons and swings and roundabouts and unintended and intended consequences. And with a lighter flywheel, what you're getting, because there is less energy being transmitted and therefore stored in the flywheel, you get an engine that revs up faster, and the whole car feels more sprightly as a result. In a road car, you probably aren't interested in that, because drivability is very important. On a car that's being used entirely on the track, reducing rotational mass helps free up power and certainly reduce inertia to get the car moving quicker and accelerating quicker. As ever, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions or comments, I'd really like to hear them. Thank you and goodbye.